Can you believe this? The Vice President of the United States, JD Vance, just got fined in a courtroom over socks. But this wasn't just any fine. This was a setup, a political hit job, an attempt to humiliate him on national television. And what happened next? Nobody saw it coming. Because instead of backing down, JD turned the tables so hard that the judge himself ended up looking like the biggest fool in legal history. This moment was supposed to be his downfall, but instead, it became the most legendary courtroom takedown of all time. Buckle up, because this story is about to get wild. And before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. If you love seeing corrupt elites get exposed, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's get into it. It all started in a federal courtroom packed wall-to-wall with journalists, legal analysts, and political commentators, all there for what should have been a routine hearing. But from the second JD Vance walked in, something felt off. The tension in the room was palpable, the kind that makes your gut tighten, the kind that tells you somebody planned something. And sure enough, sitting at the bench was Judge Martin Calloway, a man who had spent years throwing subtle jabs at conservatives from behind his robe. Today, however, he wasn't being subtle. He was going for blood. The moment JD took his seat, Calloway tapped his gavel twice, leaned forward, and smirked. "Mr. Vance, before we proceed, let's address a pressing issue." JD raised an eyebrow. The room went silent. The judge cleared his throat and, with the kind of smug arrogance that only comes from knowing you have the power to ruin someone's day, said, "You're in contempt of court." JD didn't flinch. "For what exactly?" Calloway gestured lazily toward JD's ankles. "Your socks." For a split second, nobody reacted. People looked at each other, confused, wondering if this was a joke. JD glanced down, white socks, bright green shamrocks. Nothing outrageous. But Calloway wasn't joking. "This is a federal courtroom, not a St. Patrick's Day celebration," the judge continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Your attire is unprofessional, and I won't tolerate such disrespect." And just like that, Calloway made the biggest mistake of his career. Because this wasn't just a petty insult, this was a trap. A deliberate, calculated move designed to make JD look ridiculous. The cameras were rolling. The headlines were already being written. Vice President violates court dress code. Contempt of court. Disrespectful. It was a classic power move, meant to remind everyone that no matter how high JD Vance climbed, the system could always put him back in his place. And then came the real bombshell. Calloway leaned back and, in a voice oozing with condescension, declared, "I'm issuing a $10,000 fine for your blatant disregard of courtroom decorum." The gasps were audible. "A fine, for socks?" The journalists in the back couldn't type fast enough. Twitter exploded. The left-wing media was already celebrating, JD Vance, humiliated. Crushed. Publicly disgraced. But what they didn't realize was that JD Vance wasn't just a politician. He was a legal genius. And Calloway had just given him the perfect opening to completely destroy him. The courtroom was silent. Dead silent. You could hear the sound of people shifting in their seats, the barely contained smirks from the judge's allies, the subtle click-click-click of journalists rapidly typing out their headlines. JD Vance humiliated in federal court. Contempt charge over Shamrock socks. The leftist media was already sharpening their knives, ready to tear him apart. But JD? He just sat there. Unshaken. Unbothered. And then, he smirked. The judge's eyes narrowed. He expected anger, embarrassment, maybe even a desperate attempt at an apology. What he didn't expect was confidence. Because JD Vance wasn't a man who played defense. He was about to do what he did best, turn the tables so hard the whole system shook. JD leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, and in a calm, almost amused voice, asked, "Your Honor, are you aware that you just violated federal law?" The courtroom froze. The judge blinked. "Excuse me?" JD reached into his briefcase, pulling out a neatly folded legal document. He unfolded it with painstaking precision, taking his sweet time, making sure every single person in that room was watching him. He held it up. Title 42, Section 2000D of the U.S. Code, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It explicitly prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in any program or activity receiving federal assistance. JD tilted his head, raising an eyebrow. "And Your Honor, would you care to tell the court what nationality these shamrocks represent?" Boom. The trap had been set. The judge's face drained of color. "Let me help you out," JD continued, his voice dripping with polite mockery. "Shamrocks are a symbol of Irish heritage. My family, like millions of Americans, traces its roots back to Ireland. By penalizing me for wearing a culturally significant symbol, you just committed an act of ethnic discrimination in a..." The tension in the federal courtroom shifted instantly. The journalists, who had been ready to crucify JD, suddenly found themselves scrambling to rewrite their stories. The judge stiffened, realization sinking in, he had walked right into JD's trap. But JD wasn't done. He stood up, pacing slowly, letting his words hang in the air. "Not only is your ruling legally indefensible, but it's also blatantly unconstitutional." His voice sharpened. "You want to talk about decorum? Fine, let's talk about decorum. Since when did the federal government start dictating which cultural symbols were acceptable in a courtroom?" JD's eyes locked onto the judge. "Would you have fined me if I were wearing a Star of David? A crucifix? A turban? Or is it just Irish Americans who get penalized in your court?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The cameras zoomed in. The judge swallowed hard. JD folded his arms. "And let's not forget something else," he added, turning toward the jury box. "Federal judges are held to the highest ethical standards. Any hint of bias or discrimination can be grounds for removal." He gestured toward the cameras, toward the hundreds of thousands watching this unfold live. "So, Your Honor, would you like to reconsider your fine, or would you prefer to have your actions reviewed by the Judicial Conduct Board?" Checkmate. The judge knew he was finished. A long pause filled the air. Then, with a clenched jaw and barely contained humiliation, Judge Calloway slammed his gavel. "Fine is revoked," he muttered. JD smiled. "Good decision, Your Honor." He sat back down, perfectly composed, while the entire courtroom exploded into chaos. The media, legal analysts, and spectators all knew they had just witnessed a complete and total takedown. As JD Vance walked out of that courtroom, one thing was clear: this wasn't just about socks. This was about power. About exposing corruption. About proving that the so-called elites, who manipulate the system, can be beaten. And JD Vance had just proved it. The courtroom erupted in stunned whispers as JD leaned back, watching the judge's face turn pale. This entire sham trial had been built on arrogance, but now the tables had turned. Vance wasn't just defending himself, he was exposing something far more sinister. With calm precision, he slid a thick folder onto the judge's desk. "Before you pass judgment," he said smoothly, "let's discuss your record." The murmur in the room died instantly. The judge's eyes darted to the stack of documents exposing his past rulings, hidden connections, and even offshore accounts linked to powerful political donors, the very people who had pushed him to target JD Vance. The cameras, initially set up to mock Vance, were now capturing something far bigger. The public wasn't just witnessing a wrongful fine over socks anymore. They were watching a corrupt official caught red-handed. The judge's lip trembled. "This is ridiculous," he stammered. But the weight of the evidence spoke louder than his words. Vance tapped the papers, his voice firm. Since we're so concerned about legal decorum, let's make sure the American people see exactly who's enforcing it. The tension shattered as gasps spread across the room. The media, once eager to mock JD, now rushed to get their headlines out: a judge who abused power, exposed by the very man he tried to humiliate. As the gavel fell, the decision wasn't just about JD Vance's socks anymore. It was about justice. And in that moment, the judge realized something chilling: he hadn't just lost the case. He had lost his career. Now, what do you think? Was this the most insane legal humiliation you've ever seen? Should the judge face consequences for this blatant abuse of power? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you love seeing corrupt elites get wrecked on their own turf, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because trust me, this is just the beginning.